During the WWF's New Generation era, a lot of new characters debuted that showcased a real lack of creativity. Duke the Dumpster Droese, Bob Sparky Plug, The Goon, Jean-Pierre Lafitte, Aldo Montoya, Isaac Yankem DDS, all these guys were put on TV in the mid-90s when business was already down, so needless to say, WWF were going through a few hardships and none of these new characters were catching on. There were exceptions, mind you, but these were few and far between. At the end of 1995 though, one of the most memorable, risky and creative characters that ever graced the wrestling ring came from the mind of Vince McMahon, and it was a character that would, without a doubt, cause a lot of controversy. It's almost like the character's mission was just that, to create controversy and to get people talking. That character was Goldust, portrayed by Dustin Rhodes, and while Goldust could easily have been an experiment that lasted a few weeks before getting put in the bad idea file, Dustin made the character work and Goldust would become a success story in the world of pro wrestling.
Well, they call him the natural as can be.
Dustin Rhodes was known to fans as the natural Dustin Rhodes during his time in WCW. The son of a plumber, Dustin was a no-nonsense Texan boy who, at the time, didn't have much of a character, but that's because he didn't really need one. Being the son of Dusty Rhodes was more than enough. Still, Dustin stood out on his own, and WCW fans warmed up to him before he left for a brief stint in WWF during the early 90s. Following this short run in New York, Dustin returned to WCW where he spent the next 4 years as a fan favourite. And again, WCW fans enjoyed seeing the natural in action. He became a 2-time WCW Tag Team Champion and 2-time United States Champion during his time in WCW. Following the well-documented King of the Road match, Dustin was fired from World Championship Wrestling and he decided to go back to WWF where Vince McMahon would present him with a new character that was very, very far away from the natural. As a matter of fact, it was far away from anything WWF had ever presented before. Through interviews with Dustin and through Bruce Pritchard's podcast, we can learn a bit more about how the Goldust idea was pitched to Dustin. But before we do that, let's take a look at some of the original concept art for the character and other characters the creative team had in mind for Rhodes upon his return. First, we can see that a regular cowboy gimmick was considered. This doesn't look too far away from the natural character, but admittedly, it looks very safe and, dare I say, a bit boring. Shadow Rhodes was another idea that made Dustin look like some sort of Mad Max character perhaps. Kinda gives me vibes of a post-apocalyptic biker or scavenger of some description, but who knows what the real idea was here. Stargate Dustin Rhodes looks like an Egyptian guard of sorts, and I'm so happy WWF didn't go with this. This kind of thing falls into that wacky 1995 New Generation nonsense that had a track record for failing hard. And then we come to Goldust. What you're going to notice in these Goldust designs is that there's no face paint involved, and at one point the designers thought a turquoise colour scheme might suit this new character. According to Dustin, Vince McMahon didn't envision Goldust wearing face paint. McMahon instead saw Goldust overdoing it a little with makeup similar to Adrian Street and Adrian Adonis, but Dustin suggested paint that covered his entire face because it was something he personally wanted to do. Dustin loved how Sting and the Great Muta looked in WCW, and he always wanted to wear face paint similar to these guys, so Vince gave it a thumbs up. There's one word that was repeated to Dustin over and over again during that first phone call with Vince, a word that Dustin had to look up when the call ended because he didn't know what it meant, and that word was androgynous. When Dustin went home and looked up the word in his dictionary, he would have read a definition like this: androgynous, having both male and female characteristics, looking neither strongly male nor strongly female. It was at that moment when Rhodes wondered just what he had gotten himself into, yet it's also very important to remember that throughout this whole character pitch and during the early days of the character's development, Dustin was all in. Rhodes said he was excited to play a new character, he was eager to get away from being just the son of Dusty Rhodes, and he wanted to do something widely different in his pro wrestling career. I think it's important to remember that Dustin wanted to try this new character just as much as Vince wanted the gimmick on TV. Vince only really told Dustin that Goldust was androgynous and not a whole lot more. On the Chris Jericho podcast, Dustin said, Vince is like, yeah, you'll be this androgynous character, and he mentioned Adrian Street and Adrian Adonis. So I remembered them and how they presented their characters and things like that. I'm like, okay, that's kind of cool, just this flamboyant person, right? That's what I thought androgynous meant, was flamboyant, and it's a little different than that. But he presented that to me and, you know, I sunk my teeth into it, and it took me a good 6 months up there to figure it out. So Goldust was shown his costume, he heard his entrance music, the folks at WWF made him feel pretty good about this new character, and everyone, including Dustin, thought a lot of money was gonna get made. Goldust was first revealed to WWF audiences through a series of pre-tape vignettes, and it's through these early vignettes where we can see exactly what the original concept was all about. We know that Goldust was to have both male and female characteristics, and in the 90s this was going to create a lot of noise, but there's way more to Goldust than just sexuality. Hollywood, motion pictures and film direction were also a key part of the Goldust character, and it's incredible how all this gets overlooked. Goldust would quote movies to get his points across, he would talk about his opponents starring in his latest blockbusters, he himself even looked like an Oscar award statue, but all this is overshadowed by every other trait that Goldust brought to the table. More on this in a moment though. Let's talk more about these debut vignettes. Goldust was obsessed with Hollywood. He said it's the place where dreams were made and dreams were shattered. His favourite actor is Marilyn Monroe, and he says there's a difference between the actors of Hollywood and Goldust. Actors are manufactured and cloned by teams of managers, producers and directors. Actors spend a lot of time learning to be something they're not, and that's the key difference between actors and Goldust. Goldust was born a star. He then said he was coming after Diesel's WWF Championship and he'd hold an award ceremony bigger than the Oscars. And in another vignette, Goldust called out The Undertaker and the Creatures of the Night. The creatures follow The Undertaker, but gold sheds no darkness, it only sheds light. Another vignette was directed at Shawn Michaels. Goldust said there would be a permanent vacancy at the Heartbreak Hotel, and he also said he was going to swoop down on the pink and black hitman like the Dark Knight. Simply put, no superstar would shine brighter than Goldust, and Goldust was gonna make sure of it. As time went on, Goldust would quote movies while telling the fans the film in question along with the actor and the year it was released.
House of Wax, 1953.
In terms of his overall look, Goldust was very unique. The bodysuit, the face paint, the golden robes, the wig, he definitely stood out and he immediately made people take notice. When it came time to put Goldust in the ring and show this new character to live audiences and viewers around the world, things went a little downhill. His debut match happened at In Your House 4, he wrestled Marty Jannetty, and Goldust admitted that he was scared to death and he wasn't sure exactly what he was supposed to do. You can also see this in his other 1995 performances, and I remember even commenting about this very early in the Reliving the War series on my channel. Goldust looked the part, that's for sure, but the more unique and risky things he would do in the ring didn't come right away. As a matter of fact, he just seemed like any other wrestler, only he had the benefit of a unique costume. Dustin said that Vince gave him a lot of freedom with the gimmick and he also gave Goldust a lot of time to develop. He said, Vince, was 110% behind the character. He was hands-on and he gave me a lot of rope when everybody else, like the Clique, were trying to get people fired and whatnot. Didn't matter, he was going with me, so he let me take my time and find the character, and it took about 7 months. Savio Vega was the man responsible for bringing Goldust out of his shell. On the AEW Unrestricted podcast, Goldust said, "It took a while and then I started working Savio Vega, and Savio would try to get me to try these couple of things that were just way over the line for me. I'm from Texas, I was raised kind of in the country, so I'm a country boy and I'm scared to death. But that's when I realised that to make something successful, you have to step out of yourself, outside of the box, and you got to create some magic of your own. You just can't be scared all the time, you gotta take a chance." We were in Madison Square Garden. This was a special night, that's why I'm telling you the story. Savio finally talked me into doing this thing. We go out there, we start wrestling and having our match. I was Intercontinental Champion at the time. He locks up with me and he says, okay, we're going to do it now. So all it was me locking up, going behind him, rubbing up and down his chest and kinda grazing over his privates downstairs. And then he pushes me away and chases me and I take a powder. That's it, that was it. The place, for the first time in like 6 or 7 months, erupted with every kind of profane thing just thrown my way. And it was like, holy shit. It was so simple and I was so scared to try that. I couldn't believe the reaction. It was major heat because you did not do that back then. So I roll in, Savio's in the corner and he's laughing his ass off. I walk up to him and I'm like, what are you laughing at? He's like, I told you man, we're going to do this again. I'm like, what are we doing? So I backed up in the corner. He says, I want you to spin me around and turn around and rub your ass on my crotch and I'll push you off and you take a powder again. That's all I did and they were louder this time. Right then in Madison Square Garden, I found Goldust and from that point on, it was a magical run for a couple of years. Old Savio's quite the unsung hero when you think about the work he did for other guys in the company, including Steve Austin, but there you have it. Savio Vega was the man who brought the more risque side of Goldust out, and from that night on, the restraints came off. Bruce Pritchard stated that not once did Vince McMahon or anyone in creative suggest that Goldust was supposed to be a gay wrestling character. Fans were very much encouraged to wonder and question Goldust's intentions and preferences, and that was also supposed to be the whole point of Goldust being androgynous. It was supposed to be this giant question mark. Goldust was a master of mind games. He did the things he did to try to get in the mind of his opponents, and he would try to gain an advantage by making his enemies wonder, what's up with this guy? Of course, it's easy to look at Goldust and see the whole thing as nothing but exploitation or perhaps a cheap way for WWF to poke fun, but over the course of the character's story arc, we would learn that Goldust was a happily married man and he had a young daughter. His wife even became his manager very early on, and while their relationship wasn't made clear right away, it was easy to tell they were close. So in essence, Goldust used suggestive and risky in-ring mannerisms to try to get in his opponent's heads, or at least that's what Dustin and WWF were trying to get across. Emphasis on the word trying. In a way, it was more about exploiting homophobia. Goldust didn't have a problem with how he acted in the ring. His wife didn't have a problem with it either. The only folks who could have issues with Goldust's mannerisms and actions were the folks watching at home or Dustin's opponents in the ring. But, as it would turn out, a lot of fans at home did have a problem with it, and it reached the point where the character would have to tone things down and eventually cease to exist for a short period of time. But we'll talk about that a bit later. Either way, Goldust provoked reactions, with some of these reactions being more visceral than others. Vince McMahon, on the final episode of Superstars in 1995, flat out said that Goldust plays into the homophobic fears of others to gain an advantage.
What the homophobic fears, if you would, so he can gain an advantage.
He said this in the middle of the Goldust and Razor Ramon rivalry. And also, while on the subject of the whole Goldust isn't gay thing, while I absolutely think there was enough room left for fans to wonder if that statement was really true, Dustin himself said that he came under attack from homophobic fans during his early days as Goldust. You'd only have to look at fan signs and listen to the crowd shouting at Goldust to know that this is true. So even if Vince McMahon said the character wasn't supposed to be homosexual, there was more than enough there to make fans draw their own conclusions. I mean, Goldust was kissing guys, feeling guys up, sending love letters, grabbing their crotches and whatnot. Nothing was off limits. But it's important to remember that this was all supposed to be Goldust's way of playing mind games. It was supposed to be all psychological. And absolutely, 100%, it's not a character that could get away with these kind of actions in modern times. To be clear also, I know that Pritchard and others say things in interviews that could be very different from what was discussed backstage. This goes without saying, but I know people are going to bring it up in the comments. But do keep in mind also that Goldust was flat out asked if he was queer in the middle of the ring during an episode of Monday Night Raw, and he said no, he wasn't.
Aren't you?
What am I?
And we might want to be right back.
Queer? No.
Further proving that Goldust did what he did to mess around with his opponents and gain a little heat from the wrestling fans of the 90s. I'll just repeat that. Gain heat from wrestling fans of the 90s. You see, people's attitudes towards gay men during this time period was heavily driven by false information and lies surrounding the AIDS crisis during the 80s. News sources and figureheads spread misinformation that turned victims who needed help into society's outcasts, and this in turn made the general public less accepting of gay men, to say the very least. Also, when Goldust rose in prominence during 1996 and when the character was in full swing, the Defence of Marriage Act was signed, an act that defined marriage as only between a man and a woman by federal law. Not only did this deny marriage equality between any two human beings who loved each other, it further isolated and discriminated against gay men and women. Being isolated in this way and being wrongly looked upon as degenerates creates room for controversy and ridicule. And here walks in a wrestling character who's been told to act in a way that's going to bring controversy and perhaps ridicule that comes from the same mindset. Goldust was developed to create controversy. Vince knew it, Pritchard knew it, and Dustin Rhodes knew it. You can't watch Goldust in 1996 and say that he didn't push buttons to get a reaction. That would be absurd. And absolutely, being a villainous wrestler who implied that he liked men made many fans look at Goldust like some sort of bad joke, and it also makes WWF look insensitive. But Goldust and the fans' overall perception of Goldust is also a great case study for how times have changed over the years. There are many folks, particularly those who have the ability and honour of reaching a wide number of wrestling fans through the internet, who look back at this character today and call it one of the worst and most unforgivable things WWF ever did. So I felt it was important to hear from LGBTQ fans in regards to Goldust and listen to their take on the gimmick, seeing most of the takes out there via Google and YouTube search are from straight dudes. My perception, and indeed the perception of morally grandstanding journalists, YouTubers and critics, could maybe be different from those with different preferences and lifestyles, and I wasn't surprised to learn that the majority of people just enjoyed the character for what it was and they appreciated the work that went into it. But to be fair too, there were also a few folks who were offended and felt that the character was a setback. Of course, along with this, you get the odd Twitter hero who wants to turn everything into an argument, but by and large, folks were more drawn into the psychological aspects of Goldust rather than the suggestiveness of his actions. Expert Bandit said, "This was one of the better gimmicks I ever saw. When he pulled that wig off for the first time and I finally realised who it was, let me tell you, I was shocked. Shocked, I tell you." Emily said, "I always found the Goldust character very amusing and fascinating. His initial WWF run started brilliantly. He broke boundaries and provided the most entertaining content during the bleak period of WWF. I also enjoyed his 2002 and 2003 run with Booker T." Here's one here that said, "I liked it because it was a great gimmick. I'm lumped with this LGBTQ+ thing as if we were monolithic, but I bet everyone has different viewpoints. I was a big fan of Dustin pre-Goldust, and so I was more shocked it was him rather than the queer overtones. Truly a great character." Super Rasby, WWF was gimmick central in 1995 and it easily could have failed, but Dustin had the talent to pull it off. He played Goldust like an outrageous John Waters character and could wrestle well enough that the matches were worth it too. He was more than just Dusty Jr., as WCW booked him. Chris says, "I feel like because it was so cartoony and so out there and not true to life that it's hard to be offended by it." Lou said, "It was 1996 and wrestling. That's my opinion." Here's one here. "I found his character in the mid-90s to be funny and awesome. As a strange teenager myself, I could relate to him, especially when I got in character. As a bisexual, I found him amazing, funny and groundbreaking. At that time, I never knew other bisexuals existed." And in the interest of fairness, here are some of the more negative comments. Kimberly's Ghost says, "The way the Goldust character was portrayed in his first 3 years is a fascinating and alarming insight into how Vince McMahon views homosexuality." The Scottish Nerd said, "Great character, but at the start it was just hateful and poisoned every LGBTQ+ character for like 10 years. The Stern J said the gimmick wasn't the issue, but the way they talked about it was, like when Lawler was on commentary dropping the F slur and then promos. Dustin did great in the role." Something Neon said, the way that Dustin portrayed the character always outshined the shittiness intended by writers or how the moral pillar of wrestling Jerry Lawler talked about him. Both he and Dusty somehow found ways to turn baffling ideas from creative into iconic characters in their own way. Lexi says, he was definitely a negative representation for us at the time, and as a trans woman who was still questioning herself at the time, he probably delayed me coming out by quite some time. That initial character fits exactly the same type of attacks we suffer today. Brian said, it's a bit of a mixed bag for me. I was still in high school when he debuted and not out myself. I found the character to be different and refreshing, but when he was a heel, the homophobic hate he got was pretty offensive. There were a lot more tweets sent my way in regards to Goldust, and I couldn't include them all in this video. But have a look at my Twitter profile and you'll see for yourself that a lot of people, the majority of people, just liked the character and they had fun watching the character. For sure though, there are people who feel a bit more strongly about the WWF's intentions when presenting such a gimmick in the mid-90s, and that's absolutely fine too. It shows us how the character and the presentation of the character affected different people in different ways. Personally, I love the psychological aspects of the character, and I got a kick out of seeing Goldust doing more provocative actions while inside the ring. When Goldust found his stride in 1996, he was one of the WWF's most entertaining aspects, and he was so unique and different that he stood above everyone else in terms of character. There's no way that you can't see the character as a risk, especially in the mid-90s, but I think it paid off and Goldust proved to be one of the more fascinating gimmicks the WWF had presented in a long time. At the same time though, there are folks out there who have the opposite opinion, as evidenced by the tweets I received. For these people, the Goldust character could have a much more profound personal effect than what it would for me, and so these folks look at Goldust and the general idea of Goldust in a much different way. These people should never be overlooked, and maybe that payoff I talked about was at the expense of these wrestling fans. How you feel about the character is your own personal choice. If you loved it, great. If you found it offensive or too close to home, that's fine too. But whatever way you felt was what the WWF were going for. The more controversial it became, the more it got people talking. That was the whole point of the gimmick. You don't push the envelope without expecting some people to get upset over it. And you're the only person who can decide if that's right or if that's wrong, not some dude who writes opinion pieces on the internet. What's also evident though is that the majority of those who found it offensive weren't necessarily angry or upset with Dustin, they were more angry or upset with the WWF. The Razor Ramon feud that began in late 1995 is worth going back to watch. It was Goldust's first big rivalry, and what's noteworthy here is the fact that Scott Hall did not want to work with Goldust at all. Scott wasn't into the Goldust character, he didn't like how it was presented and he didn't like the way Goldust acted in the ring. But still, Scott would end up dropping the Intercontinental Championship to Goldust in a storyline that really did give fans a lot to talk about. Goldust made it clear that he liked Razor. He liked Razor so much that he got a little Razor Ramon tattoo on his chest, and he even sent Razor letters and gifts. The bad guy said he couldn't read the letter on TV due to it being unsuitable for younger viewers, so it all played into the mystery of Goldust. In the end, the mind games worked. Goldust defeated Razor Ramon at the 1996 Royal Rumble and he won the IC belt in the process, so the ends justified the means. The Hollywood Backlot Brawl at WrestleMania 12 is an interesting matchup. Roddy Piper didn't hold back when addressing Goldust, and many of the things Piper said would raise eyebrows today. But Goldust took it all in his stride and he used Piper's insecurities to mess around with the hot rod even more. Some of the promos that Goldust cut in the run-up to WrestleMania 12 were fantastic. Piper got the better of Dustin at WrestleMania 12, but Goldust showed everyone how tough he was during the backstage part of the matchup. He took some very stiff shots in this one. The lingerie he wore under his gear later in the show was a Dustin Runnels idea. He revealed that he had to get approval from Vince McMahon. There's also an excellent Savio Vega vs Goldust match that happened on Raw on the 15th of April 1996. This isn't the match Dustin talked about earlier, but it's a good example of how comfortable both Savio and Goldust were in the ring together. If you want to see Goldust push every button imaginable, then this is the one to check out, and the rematch the following week. Finally, there's a Goldust vs Shawn Michaels dark match from In Your House Buried Alive. This can only be seen on the WWE's Attitude Era Volume 3 unreleased DVD and Blu-ray, but I made a video about the match on my channel. It's a fun little bout with Goldust singing Shawn's theme before the two have a great match that should have been on the pay-per-view itself. There were many places this character could go in 1996 in particular, but things got watered down a lot when sponsors and viewers, mostly parents, complained about the character. According to Vince Russo, USA Network were getting a ton of complaints and Goldust was on the verge of costing WWF some big brand deals while also putting existing sponsorships in jeopardy, so everything had to get reined in. Goldust would turn babyface. He would explain in a series of interviews that Goldust was created so Dustin could step away from his dad and so Dustin could be his own person. The gimmick was all toned down, and this resulted in everything that made the character unique not being there anymore. Then, towards the end of 1997, and due to the antics of D-Generation X, the USA Network realised that the more risque WWF got, the more people were tuning in, particularly young males. So Goldust ended up turning heel again after ditching his wife Marlena in favour of Luna Vachon. This gave fans the artist formerly known as Goldust, and things then got really bizarre. The artist wore colourful outfits, colourful wigs, he had a gag on occasion. Other times he was on a leash. It was like Goldust was put into turbo mode with absolutely no brakes and no creative restraints, and to be honest, I didn't think it hit nearly as hard as the original Goldust. As mentioned earlier, the psychological aspects of Goldust was what drew myself and others into the gimmick, but the artist felt like it was only done for shock value. On top of this, the character just wasn't that successful, there were no championship reigns, he wasn't featured on a weekly basis, and eventually it was phased out in favour of Goldust pretending to be other people like Hunter Dust, Marilyn Dust, and Dusty Dust. Knowing that the character was falling out of favour, Goldust pitched the idea of getting breast implants to Jim Ross, Bruce Pritchard, and eventually Vince McMahon. This was all confirmed by Dustin, Ross and Pritchard, by the way, and of course Vince McMahon did not allow it. Jim Ross wrote in his first book, "The hot creative ideas were slowing for the Goldust character, and we had all been brainstorming for new ideas. Dustin comes into a small room at Madison Square Garden, takes a seat and proceeds to tell me that he has an idea that will put him back on the map. With a film crew present, he wants to go under the knife and have a breast implant procedure, essentially making him the first she-male character in sports entertainment history. He suggested that he would be huge on the talk show circuit, and people all over the world would be clamouring to see the bizarre one in person." I was shocked at what I was hearing. Here I am, this Oklahoma farm boy sitting in New York's Madison Square Garden, having one of the most unique conversations of my life with a large man with a bleach blonde buzz cut who wants to get a bona fide boob job. He indicated it would be worth the sacrifice because the character would be the hottest new thing in the world and the money would be rolling in for everyone. I said he really needed to speak to Vince McMahon, the chairman of WWE, on this one, as I did not feel comfortable approving this elective surgery from my talent relations budget. Vince had an astonished look on his face, and as he told me later, he thought he was being ribbed. It was not a rib. After Dustin finished, Vince explained that he appreciated Dustin attempting to develop new concepts for the character and continued to brainstorm on them. Still, Vince did not think this particular creative idea was the direction we wanted to travel. Later, I asked Goldust's then wife, Terry, if she knew about this concept, and she answered, rolling her eyes and nodding her head. That pretty well covered it. Dustin would end up burning the Goldust outfit on TV, he became a born-again Christian, and he would then end up bringing the Goldust character back again, but again it wasn't the same as before. When he went back to WCW, the creative geniuses had him debut a new character named Seven just for the sake of working the audience with a shoot promo and killing the character off from the moment he got in the ring. And then he just reverted back to good old Dustin Rhodes. Over the years, Goldust would make returns to WWF where he had good times and he had bad times. As Emily Rose mentioned in her tweet earlier, he had a memorable run with tag team partner Booker T that many fans enjoyed. People are going to remember Goldust stuttering his words and having a mild case of Tourette's during this run, but the allure and the mystique of the character was never recaptured, and to be honest, it was always impossible to do such a thing all these years later. Still, Goldust will always be part of Dustin Runnels as evidenced in his AEW run. I love how he incorporates his old character into his AEW face paint. Goldust was put away for good, but there's still elements of the character that stayed with Dustin as he began his journey in All Elite Wrestling. Today, Dustin doesn't play up to the character or the gimmick, but he doesn't shy away from showing everyone that it was a big part of his career, and he's held in very high regard by fans who tune into AEW every week due to the work and effort he put into his craft. 35 years this man has wrestled for, and he shows no signs of slowing down. As a matter of fact, many believe his greatest match happened in 2019 when he faced brother Cody at AEW Double or Nothing. Whether you saw Goldust as a genius idea, an underhanded and shitty way for WWF to poke fun at people, or just another wrestler in a world filled with over-the-top gimmicks, Goldust will always be very, very memorable. I've said before that I wasn't fond of his babyface runs in WWF, particularly in 1997, and I also said that I wish Goldust could have kept doing what he was doing during the early days of the gimmick, but no matter what I or anyone else thinks, Goldust will always be one of the most interesting and fascinating characters in pro wrestling history. You could actually say he was the man who really kickstarted the Attitude Era years before the phrase Attitude was used in WWF. And he was right, he said it all along, we will never forget the name